And together, we will move mountains. And if they don't hear our message, then we'll just do it over and over and over and over 1,000 times again for you.
And I'll rise up, I'll rise like the day, I'll rise up in spite of you. I will rise, we will rise, we will rise, we will rise.
Hello, my name is Michelle Zabel and my pronouns are she and her. I'm an assistant dean at the University of Maryland School of Social Work and the proud director of the Institute for Innovation and Implementation. Today, I'm just delighted to welcome you to this Training Institute live workshop. As you might have come to expect with all your favorite conferences, the Training Institutes are now virtual. And although I know we'd all like to be together in person, we are excited to host the virtual Training Institutes and really want to encourage you to continue to join us on the first Thursday of every month through August. Each month, you'll have a choice of 2 back-to-back workshops. So mark your calendars, choose your workshops, and make sure you reserve your place early so that you can attend the workshop that most interests you. Today, I want to encourage you to actively participate by using the chat to post your questions, post your comments, and share your resources with your colleagues. Our presenters, they definitely want to hear from you. And it is absolutely your participation that will make each of these sessions a success. As a reminder, staff are monitoring the chat and they're going to make sure the facilitators see your questions and comments, so be sure and engage. A few other reminders to include: if you need assistance at any time navigating through these virtual spaces or accessing links to workshops, we do have a live help desk support standing by to assist. We are also providing a certificate of attendance after the completion of each workshop, and all of our workshops are being recorded, so by you participating, you're implying consent. Finally, there will be an ASL interpreter or closed captioning available during each workshop. Those interpreters can be pinned when available for those who require interpretation by hovering over the interpreter's video and selecting the 3 dots. One of the options that will appear is pin video. By selecting the pin video, this video will not move out of view. Following the workshop, we will have a wellness and mindfulness break with guided activities before our second afternoon session. With our theme, What Could Be? Bolder Systems and Brighter Futures for Children, Youth, Young Adults, and their Families, all of our sessions will challenge us to envision a future where the voices of children, youth, young adults, and their families are elevated, especially those who are most frequently silenced or marginalized, where we use the best data and research available to challenge ourselves, developing new ideas and approaches that can be implemented to meet the needs of youth and families, and in service of our commitment to social justice and the elimination of disproportionality and disparities. My hope is that today's session will provide you with food for thought as you consider your next steps in creating a vibrant, equitable future for youth with complex needs and their families. Please don't forget to register for next month's workshop. Remember, they're held the first Thursday of every month, and you can visit the institute.umaryland.edu for the full schedule. Thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you next month.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Building Youth Engagement Starts with Best Practice, Starts with Assessment. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Alice Topoloff. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm representing Youth Move National, and I've been working on the Y-VAL tool, which we'll be focusing on today, from its development to supporting folks implementing the Y-VAL at their agency for over 3 years now. I'm calling today from Decorah, Iowa. Here with me are Kippy and Zai, and I'll let them introduce themselves before we get started. Kippy, do you want to say a few words about yourself?
Great. I'm Kippy Clausen. I go by she, her pronouns. I am the Youth Development and Peer Specialist Technical Assistance Provider in Colorado for COACT, our Colorado System of Care. And I'm calling in from Littleton, Colorado. Zai.
Hi, I'm Zyshawn Jackson. I go by he, him, his. I'm the Youth Voice Coordinator in Colorado Springs, also Youth Move Colorado Vista.
Thanks, Zion Kippy. So here's a brief overview of what we'll be talking about today during this presentation. First, we'll talk about the importance of authentic youth engagement, the need for a youth voice assessment tool, and data-driven technical assistance. Then we'll present the Y-VAL, the Youth Voice at the Agency Level assessment tool. Then I'll hand it off to Kippy and Zai, who will talk about how this tool was implemented in Colorado and how they are using the tool and its results to move forward with their youth engagement strategies. Finally, we'll leave some time for questions and answers. We have a couple of polls throughout to keep this somewhat lively, so please stay tuned for your turn to participate. We strongly encourage folks to use the chat box to ask questions. As I mentioned, there will be a moderated Q&A portion at the end of the presentation, but feel free to ask questions at any time. Okay, let's get to it. So what is the Y-VAL and why is it important? First, a brief word about Youth Move National. Youth Move National is a youth and youth-driven chapter membership organization dedicated to improving service and systems that serve youth, such as mental health, juvenile justice, education, and child welfare. MOVE stands for Motivating Others Through Voices of Experience. Members share their voices and experience through advocacy and leadership activities to change the very systems that they have lived through. There are over 65 chapters nationwide. One of the core aspects of Youth Move's work is to support agencies in implementing authentic youth engagement strategies. What does that mean? Youth-driven means young people have the right to be empowered, educated, and given a decision-making role in the care of their own lives, as well as the policies and procedures governing care for all youth in the community, state, and nation. It's giving young people a sustainable voice and then listening to that voice. Youth-guided organizations create safe environments that enable young people to gain self-sustainability in accordance with the culture and beliefs with which they identify. There is a continuum of power that should be shared with young people based on their understanding and maturity in a strength-based change process. Youth-guided organizations recognize that this process should be fun and worthwhile. Zai, can you give us some concrete perspective on what might that look like on the ground as a youth peer provider?
Absolutely. Absolutely. As a youth peer support, I coordinate youth into our systems and making sure that youth voice is always highlighted. So if anything in our community wants to change, anything wants to be highlighted, we need data, we need youth voice around the table. I'm that person that connects youth to our professionals and vice versa. I'm constantly with schools, organizations, in and out of different systems, DHS, probation, the judicial system, things like that. And I'm just highlighting youth voice. Like, how did you feel? Like, did you feel like your voice was heard in this system? And what would you like to change? And then from there, I really highlight like, hey, let's jump on how we can change some of these things and really making sure that their voice is heard and that we're being sustainable and using their power to say like, hey, you're a part of this change and actively using them.
Awesome, thanks, Zai. So the young people and agencies that we work with have had to adapt their strategies for the environment we currently live in. 1 year into the pandemic, here are some of the things that we know. Reliable internet access is not equally available for youth. Second, Zoom fatigue is real, particularly for youth attending school in online environments. Third, we need to strive to build tangible connections when possible. This means things like mailing actual letters, dropping off snack packages, etc. Fourth, we need to create opportunities to share feedback in multiple ways. Some youth only have the energy for short surveys, others value some small focus group that offer community building. Make sure you are seeking out youth voice to the same extent, pandemic or no pandemic. Fifth, we should create space for work and fun. And finally, the priority should be to offer connections to mental health services and supports, which has been an increased need during the pandemic. Zai, I'm going to tee it off to you again. What have you found this past year? What does youth engagement during the pandemic look like for your role?
Initially, it was pretty hard. I found that youth were already Zoom fatigued. They had hours of school on Zoom, and they didn't necessarily want to engage with the panel. They didn't necessarily want to jump in for community support. But more recent, I found that we're jumping back into the wave of things. So what I'll do is I'll try to respect the youth time, given that they're on Zoom so long these days. I'll try to schedule a 30-minute panel of like, hey, we want to know this information, trying to get straight to the point and respecting their time and their space. And then also that work balance of work and fun. So I tell them like, hey, there's certain places in Colorado that are open. And in a small group, like we'll split it up. We'll try to go to like a quick lunch, like separate the tables and things or something like that, just to get them out of the space and get them to know like it's okay and we still want your support, and just letting them know their value. Because a lot of times in the early stages, they were like, maybe I'm not as needed. So I've tried to re-highlight how important they are to me and how important their information is.
Awesome. Thank you. So now that we've covered some of the basics around youth engagement, I'm going to hand it off to Kippy to talk about what youth engagement might look like at different levels.
And this is really an important conversation. We've had this in Colorado, and I know it goes on across the country. And one of the things that's so important at the different levels is that young people can be engaged at all levels. And so I talk about the individual level, that's for themselves, that's advocacy, that's showing up and being in a person-centered program, or being the one that, you know, kind of is moving things along. Organizational, that is really individual organizations. And, you know, I will say that that is the complexity when we have this conversation, is you need to understand the organization is a cornerstone, but it influences both our young adults and it has impact on our bigger system. When we did this in Colorado, and also when we were starting our Youth Move chapter, it was really interesting, this ladder of youth voice. Having a conversation about this was really critical because everybody was looking at it a little bit different. And you know, what feels tokenism to me is very different than what it might feel like to someone else. And so I would just say, from engagement at all levels, it's important to do that. There's some great system of care resources. But for today's purposes, I want to highlight that the Y-VAL is really the tool you use organizationally. There's another tool that you can talk more about that's really, you know, moving along, which is the Y-VOC, which really is looking at the system stuff. There's also a tool, I call it a sister tool, which is the youth participation and planning tool, which is something that also was kind of done with the researchers that help Youth Move get this. And I say that if you don't have a way to use your data from an organizational perspective to know what does that mean as a system, and also you're not using your organizational data to understand how that impacts an individual and going back and making sure you have change, it's awful hard to say that you have engagement at all levels. And Alice, what's been your experience as you look at using the Y-VAL? How has that been important?
Thanks, Kippy. Yeah, I think you nailed it right on the head. The Y-VAL really helps folks measure youth engagement at the organizational level, which we'll be talking about in a little more detail here shortly. I want to show another tool here that we have used also to kind of illustrate the broad spectrum of youth engagement, right? We have one tool being the Hearts ladder of youth engagement, and this is another representation. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through every single detail in this chart, but the slides will be available and you'll have access to this table. I do want to highlight that in this chart, it shows that roles for youth span from the far left side, where youth are informed, they're given information, to the very far right side of this chart, where youth are really empowered. They're seen as decision makers and real leaders in the youth movement. And then there's everything in between, right? And then at the bottom here are the core values of system of care. Again, this is a different way to represent the different levels of youth engagement at an individual, organizational, and systemic level. So this might be the point in the presentation where you're asking yourself, okay, this is great, but what does this have to do with the Y-VAL? Well, the point of going over some of the core aspects of authentic youth engagement at different levels why it's important, and what that might look like for youth roles, I think it's clear now that having a tool that would help assess or measure that youth engagement is important. And that's exactly what our Youth Best Practice Committee thought. So Youth Move National has a Youth Best Practice Committee that's made up of youth and young adults with lived experience, as well as supportive adults who are especially qualified to guide how youth voice, youth engagement, and youth peer support can really change and improve mental health, child welfare, juvenile justice, and all youth serving systems. In 2017, the Youth Best Practice Committee identified a need to understand concretely what supports exist for youth and young adult voice at agency and system levels. They wanted a tool that would help clarify what resources and commitments are required for authentic youth engagement. This tool would also help prevent reinventing the wheel and/or cause distress or harm to young people hired in these positions. This tool would also provide a tailored and data-driven approach for developing, implementing, and advancing youth-driven activities. And finally, this tool would help young people advocate for meaningful participation and support. As a result of these needs, the Youth Best Practice Committee developed a framework of key indicators and best practices for successful youth and young adult voice, and that is the Y-VAL. So a quick overview of the Y-VAL. The purpose of the Y-VAL is threefold. One is to identify best practices, two is to inform stakeholders, and then third is to allow creditable assessment. The Y-VAL was developed in full collaboration with Portland State University and Youth Move National. There were multiple rounds of both structured and open-ended stakeholder review. A validation study was conducted with agencies around the country. On the side here, there's a link to the research paper that was published as a result of the validation study. It's now available for use, either with support from Youth Move National or as a do-it-yourself approach, and we'll go over that in a little bit. So how can the Y-VAL be used? The Y-VAL provides a framework of key indicators of meaningful and successful youth and young adult voice in program design at the agency level. This framework might be useful for agencies who are just starting or revamping youth programs and want a guide on what a good youth engagement might look like concretely. Secondly, we've talked about the value of youth voice and the benefits of authentic youth engagement. Assessing that allows for collective and reflective process to better understand where the agency is at with youth and young adult voice. This assessment allows organizations to promote a shared vision for success, identify strengths and needs, and support agencies with moving forward towards sustainable engagement. Third, this assessment requires the young people at an agency to participate and helps young people advocate for meaningful participation and support by giving them the tools to do so. Finally, agencies can take this tool in a pre and post intervention, such as technical assistance, a policy implementation, strategic plan development, etc. And using it as a pre and post measurement tool will help assess the impact of that intervention. So enough about the theory. Here is what the Y-VAL tool actually looks like. The Y-VAL is split into 8 themes or domains. Within each themes, there are 3 to 8 items. Each of these items is a youth engagement best practice that could be implemented at an agency. For each of the items, participants rate the level of implementation of that strategy at their agency. This is all very theoretical, so to keep it more concrete, I'll give a brief overview of the 8 domains. We'll give an example of an item or best practice within each domain. Then we'll have you participate in a couple of mock questions via a poll so you can get a first-hand feel for the tool. The 8 themes are, from top left to bottom right here. First is overall vision and commitment. The agency has developed formal structures and policies for youth voice and participation. This means that there are clear rules for youth and young adult participation and a transparent assessment of efforts to promote participation. Theme 2, collaborative approach. Young people are treated as valued partners in decision processes. They are involved from the beginning, including in decisions about what goals to focus on and how to address them. There is respect and mutual learning, willingness to compromise, responsiveness. Meetings are youth-friendly, and there is information and transparency about what will happen or has happened as a result of these decisions. The third theme is empowered representatives. Young people are supported in a way that will maximize their potential to have an impact on their decisions. Multiple young people participating consistently over time. Things don't rely solely on one single youth champion. Young people are not only invited to meetings, but they are supported through preparation. Meetings happen as planned. Theme 4, commitment to facilitation and support of youth and young adult participation. The agency invests in resources to support that participation through dedicated staff time, addressing barriers to participation, providing incentives for participation, etc. Theme 5, workforce development. The agency ensures that all staff are able to interact collaboratively with young people. Young people participate actively in hiring decisions. Staff are trained about agency policies and commitment to participation. Theme 6, participation and development of program and program policies. Young people have an impact on how the program works with the population that they serve. They are systematically involved in decisions about program models and services, but also in efforts to improve retention, access to services, and making the organization more youth-friendly and responsive. Theme 7, participation and evaluation. Young people are engaged in efforts to determine how well the agency is doing the work. Not only are young people engaged in developing programs, but there is a systematic effort to gather feedback on services, and young people help decide how efforts will be assessed, get to discuss evaluation findings, and the agency acts on recommendations young people make. Theme 8 is leading initiatives and projects. The agency supports young people to take the lead on projects that they design by providing tangible support to initiatives initiated by young people, and there is transparency about funding distribution. This is an overview of the themes. And for each item or best practice within each theme, we'll ask respondents if and to what extent that strategy has been implemented at their agency. Participants score the item on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is least developed, none of the aspects are in place at the agency, and 5 is fully developed. All of the aspects of that best practice are in place at their agency. This slide illustrates that scale from 1 to 5. Participants can also respond not applicable, this does not apply, or I do not know about this. So in this slide deck, we give one example of one item per domain for each of the 8 domains. In the interest of time, I'm going to pull out a few examples, but we wanted you to have access to all the examples in this slide deck if you're interested in looking at those items in more detail. So the first theme is, again, overall vision and commitments. One of the items is around formal policy. Implementing that full best practice would mean that the agency has a formal policy that describes why and how it involves young people in decision making and advising. This policy would describe the types of decision making and advising that the youth and young adult will participate in. It will describe the levels in which the youth and young adults will have decision making power. They will have decision making power. For example, whether youth and young adult will have equal say in what is decided. Young people collaborated in developing that policy, and it is periodically updated to reflect new circumstances. The policy is written in a language that young people find easy to understand. So that would be one of the questions in the assessment. Let's say you're taking the assessment and your agency does not have any formal policy around youth involvement. Then you would probably rate this question a 1 out of 5. Or your agency might have some of the aspects in place. For example, your agency does have a formal policy that describes why and how it involves young people in advising and decision making, and young people have collaborated in developing the original content of this policy, but this policy hasn't been updated for 6 years, and the language is full of hyper-technical terms and acronyms. Your agency has some of these aspects in place, but not all. So you might score this question a 3 or 4 out of 5. I will mention that this theme 1, overall vision and commitment, is where we tend to find some of the highest scores for agencies. The fact that agency leadership is allocating time and resources for the agency to take the Y-VAL shows that there is an overall commitment to youth engagement. The decision has been made at the agency level to prioritize youth engagement, and high scores in this theme reflect that. I'll give a second example. So the second theme is collaborative approach. And one of the items here is youth and young adult friendly meetings. What this might look like. The agency has worked with young people to establish good meeting practices that encourage young people to engage in meeting activities. Good meeting practices include providing meeting materials in advance, keeping meetings short and efficient, begin with icebreakers or sharing time, explain acronyms and jargon, and provide food and taking regular breaks. Meetings are scheduled at times and locations that youth and young adults can actually attend. Going to skip through theme 3 for now, and then go right to theme 4. The fourth domain is commitment to facilitation and support of youth and young adult participation. This is usually where rubber tends to hit the road. It's great to have good intentions and for things to be prioritized on paper, which is usually what we see in the first couple of themes. And it's another to actually put systems and infrastructure in place to truly support youth and young adult participation. And this theme gets to that. So one of the items in this theme is dedicated staff time. What this looks like is the agency employs someone to help support youth and young adults to participate in advising and decision-making. This person is either a youth and young adult with lived experience or someone with relevant expertise that is selected by youth and young adults. If the agency does not have a staff member who does this, then the agency contracts with a youth and young adult run organization to support youth and young adult participation. Youth and young adult have significant input in selecting the person for this role and may prioritize demonstrated skills in supporting youth and young adult participation over lived experience. Just a heads up that this is going to be a poll where we will be asking you this question. Skip a couple next slides. Move right on to the last domain, which is leading initiatives and projects. So if you remember the ladder of youth engagement that we mentioned earlier, this might be getting at one of the top rungs of the ladder, youth-led and youth-driven practices. It's also what would be at the very right of the chart, referencing the array of youth roles, empowering youth. It also happens to be, somewhat unsurprisingly, a domain or theme where agencies tend to score a little less high than previous domains. So one of the examples that we picked to illustrate this theme is control of funds. Youth and young adult leaders control or co-control funds that they raise or co-raise. There is transparency around how these funds are distributed and used. For example, youth and young adults understand that the cost of hosting a fundraising event may be deducted from the amount of funds that they raised. So this was a brief overview of some of the domains, and now we're going to be asking you to play. So before we launch the poll, here's how it's going to work. We're going to pretend like your agency has decided to take the YVAL as an assessment of youth engagement practices at your agency. You are one of the people that was selected to take the assessment on behalf of your agency. It's anonymous, so we hope that you'll be honest about your score. The question is one that we covered during the presentation. So it's theme 4, commitment to facilitation and support of youth and young adult participation around dedicated staff time. I'll let folks look at the screen for the questions, and then maybe we can launch the poll and give folks 45 seconds or so to answer. So again, the question is around dedicated staff time. We'll launch the poll, and you'll have to answer whether on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is none of the aspects are in place or true for your agency, and 5 is all of these aspects are consistently in place or completely true for your agency. You can also respond, not applicable, this does not apply. I see the poll is up. And while people answer, I will just add that this is an example that we picked because it's sometimes not an obvious role. People like to think sometimes that youth engagement will happen kind of magically and not necessarily have some systems and infrastructure in place to support that commitment. Great, maybe we can close the poll. Great, I think everybody can see the answers. It looks like 11% don't have any of the system in place, 6% have all of the items in place, and the majority, so 28%, have some of the items in place, but not all. Great, thank you so much for indulging. So now that you've got the hang of it, we'll do it again with a new question. So this is around theme 7, participation and evaluation. The question is on feedback on services. The agency regularly gathers confidential feedback from young people receiving services to ensure the programming is meeting their needs. Not only is the agency gathering feedback, but young people do not experience negative consequences as a result of giving honest feedback. Again, the answers are from 1 to 5, where 1 is none of the aspects are in place or true for your agency, and 5 is fully developed, everything is true for your agency. And we'll launch the poll. Thank you. Theme 7 is often an interesting one that tends to, where agency scores vary widely. We tend to think that if agencies are willing to take the YVAL as an assessment tool, it usually means that they're pretty open and transparent about youth participating in other assessments and evaluations. So the scores in this theme are often a very good base for conversation within the staff and what's considered evaluation and what's considered feedback and how that input is gathered. Give it a few more seconds. Drum roll. Great. So looking at the results, it looks like there are a few more people who have this strategy implemented at their agency. It looks like 22% answered that this was fully developed. That's great. Okay. We'll close the polls for now. So that now that you are all looking forward to taking this tool at your agency, here's what implementation looks like. We ask that at least 15 people take an online survey, including youth and young adult participants. This 15-person threshold helps maintain anonymity so that we can't identify a specific response to a specific person. And it also helps provide a true representation of the agency. If you're only picking 5 or 6 people from your agency out of a team of 50, those 5 or 6 people may not have a broad perspective to present. With Youth Move National support, a point person at the agency will be sent a survey link and asked to share the link with relevant people at their agency. Youth Move National will help send reminders, track participation, etc., and then generate an agency-specific report that will include YVAL scores, areas of growth, and resources and technical assistance in those tools. If you're interested in learning more about the tool, you can contact Youth Move National at the email address that's on the screen here, or check out our webpage that the Institute staff so kindly put in the chat box. So this is an example of what the reporting, some of the content of the report might look like. We first give an overview of your agency's average scores by theme. In red here are the agency's average scores. The whisker box around the red dot represents the breadth of responses at your agency. If the whisker box is very small, it means that respondents tended to score the answer very closely. If it's very large, it means that the respondents tended to score the answer very differently. And that's also a point of interest and a point of conversation. Why did certain participants rate it one way and other participants rate it another way? In blue is the average that was calculated during the validation study of the YVAL tool. Note that for the validation study, we reached out to agencies who we know were doing youth engagement work. So this average might be higher than a true national average, but we like to provide that as a comparison. After giving folks an overview of the averages by theme, we give detailed averages by item within each theme. So for example, this is what it might look like for one of the themes, workforce development and readiness. And then on the left here are all the different best practices within that theme. So there are close to 40 best practices that are listed in the YVAL. And we know it's impossible for an agency to focus on all of those 40 best practices. So we use the average scores to suggest to agencies areas of focus. We highlight 3 to 5 areas of strength, which would have the highest scores, and 3 to 5 areas of growth, some with the lowest scores. And these areas are used to tailor relevant resources, support, and technical assistance. It also helps determine short, medium, and long-term goals for the agency. So now that I've given an overview of the YVAL, I'm going to hand it off to Kippy and Zaishan, who will talk about the implementation of the tool in their states and next steps that stem from it.
Great,
The floor is all yours.
So I'll go ahead and get started a little bit about Colorado and COAC. So COAC Colorado is actually our Colorado System of Care grant. We are implementing it proudly in many of the states in Colorado. Within that, you know, it's important to understand that we have a really diverse state. So with first round of YVAL, it was during we call it our COAC 2.0. We had 17 counties that participated in it. And they were a good mix of rural and urban. With our newest System of Care grant, it's 100% rural and frontier communities, and that's about 21 counties in Colorado that will be involved in that. Next. So what was important when we did the YVAL is really this big dilemma that I think many organizations think about where they get stuck in is, you know, how do we engage youth voice from a statewide perspective? We're housed at the Office of Behavioral Health, and it was really important to us to make sure, which often is the unfortunate thing, is that a lot of times it's the urban centers of our state. So people know Denver and they know Boulder and they know Colorado Springs, eyes in Colorado Springs. They might know some of our bigger communities, but we wanted to make sure there was a way to ensure that we got voice and young people were able to guide our work as the System of Care. And we didn't have a way that we could do that really well. And so we reached out to Youth Move. And part of it was this thought of, you know, people don't realize that Colorado is a big, big state. We are 73% rural or frontier. One of our counties have more sheep in it than they do have people. I have one county that's part of our System of Care that has a total of 400 people in it. And it actually, to get from point to point, would take you almost 2.5 hours. And so what happened is we really wanted to say, what do we do and how do we do it? Next slide. And so what we ended up doing is really thinking about, in our plan, how could we move this forward? And so we had a couple goals that I think are really important. You know, we wanted to do this opportunity to really train and coach and build this infrastructure using our young people. We had 2 really big questions we were looking at, like how do we expand the service array for young people and children in our system? And then really what's young people's role in this? And who better to involved in that is our brilliant young people. And so we started on this wonderful task of developing what we called COAC Youth Peer Support, or our Youth Move Colorado chapter. And I'll turn it over to Zai to talk a little bit about what the work we do that is foundational to how we use the YVAL. Next slide.
Yes. So just like Kippy said, this is our youth peer support model, and I'll just start reading. So we start with the coaching and mentoring. So helping our youth build skills and complete steps to access community resources, services, and supports that promote personal responsibility and self-sufficiency. Often involved in preparing and completing LinkedIn goals and tasks linked to problem-solving teams such as wraparound permanency roundtables or ISST meetings. So just involving youth to that next level of like, hey, we really want you here. We really want to coach you into these new systems, just trying to be more involved. And then next we have the community organizing. So building networks where peers help groups of youth build connections that increase community normalcy and engagement. These activities help youth navigate informal and formal resources. So exactly like it says, so community organizing, really how we can get our youth together, get them to support each other in and out, whether they're in a system or they're not in a system. Advocacy and leadership, helping youth by developing their personal knowledge, ownership, and resources and services, and actively advocating for needs, building networks of leaders, and increasing opportunity to build social capital. So same thing. So we get them to that level of they're now self-sufficient, and we want to build new leadership, new community leaders with our youth and our young people, so that they can better support our schools, better support our youth that are in the system, better support any youth throughout our communities, and really instilling that leadership in them.
So when you look at this slide, and Zai, I can't remember, I know we've known each other an awful long time, right?
Yeah.
What was important is we developed, like all of you, when you get your grants or you look at your programs, you develop these wonderful strategic plans. And we thought about this, we met with young people, and we kind of put this out here. And we had this pause because there wasn't a lot of traction. I mean, it was happening in pockets and there were things going on, but our ideas seemed to be a little stuck. And what we started to say is, you know, maybe there needs to be a lot more work about preparing organizations. So COAC has been around for about 6 years. I've been blessed to be involved at the very beginning. And so we took a pause, and we actually, that's what we use the Y-VAL for, is we really saw this as a tool to really be thinking about, what does readiness look like to really engage young people? How can your organization really prepare for that? Because one of the things we know about youth voice and youth engagement is there's tons of false starts, because sometimes the organization has great ideas, just like Alice said in the overall commitment. I have not met an organization that says we do not believe in youth voice and youth-centered planning or young people at the table, but it's the how-to to get there. And so we really saw the Y-VAL is our way to get there. So you can flip to the next slide. So what we did is we spent a while, you'll hear a little bit more about this. We were lucky enough to get an AmeriCorps planning grant. And we use this as a really foundational way to start getting going. And so we, when I got in my car, and I spent a lot of time in going around in person, meeting with young people, meeting with our organizations, and getting a lot of buy-in. And so we got a lot of local buy-in and saying, yep, this is what we need to do. There became a great understanding of the concept of youth development. And in our state, we actually have a legislatively mandated youth development plan that has to be updated each year, that talks about, you know, what we're doing in this arena in all of our state agencies. We also have this wonderful effort of which used to be called 9 to 25, but we had this great effort of putting these pieces together. But what we didn't have is a lot of linkage. We didn't understand how pieces went together. And so we had community meetings, and there became this important conversation of, let's start doing this in local organizations. So we actually, through this feedback, did some planning and identified key places where we were going to do the Y-VAL. And in doing the Y-VAL, we had 17 county mental health centers. So they were mixed. They were either mental health centers, Department of Human Services. Zai is at a thing in our state. They're called a collaborative management program. They're state mandated places where all of the children's serving systems have to get together regularly and plan and decide how to allocate resources in their community. So we had a mix of those types of agencies come together. big and small counties. And we then began this survey process. And the survey process was really important. So I will tell you that, we looked at accommodations to make sure it could happen. There are places in Colorado that do not have broadband. We have young people that do not have access to technologies or computers. And so we also have a lot of non-English speakers. And when we do our posts, we actually have the Y-VAL. I don't know if you know this, Alice, we translate it, we have it in Spanish. And we started to say it was super important that we used the language of those who were taking the survey. And so we set up this process where we surveyed organizations and they did it either electronic or they did it in paper, and we got our data in. And we actually had two pots of data. We have individual sites who met that 15 number threshold. They had enough data for their individual, but for some of our teeny tiny counties, they maybe were just shy. And so they use the statewide data. We put it all together as a statewide data. Some of the small counties and capacity challenges that I would highlight is, small doesn't mean you can't do this. In fact, one of our smallest communities, they're considered frontier, were one of the communities that got enough data to have their own report. And Denver, I love them to death. They didn't have enough data for their individual report. And that is one of the most important challenges, is to really have your group sit down and think about who are our people, how do we identify them, and how do we work with them to make sure we get our survey in. And so, our lessons learned is, we had a good list of it. So not only did we have our site lead send out the link that you can get, but we also had individual site leads where we had the name, and I was the person who sent the information to them because I was a little more official. So we looked at really interesting ways to do that. Another capacity challenge was really sitting down with everyone and preparing them for what they were going to do when they got the data. And that I would say you start at the beginning, and Zai is remembering that. And how many meetings did we have in El Paso? You and I tag team on meetings often to explain this, didn't we?
Yeah, absolutely. All the time we were tag teaming, seeing what would be best and seeing how many we would really need to develop. And yeah, you and I were always in talks about how we're gonna tackle this.
Yeah, and what was great is, the young people like Zai were involved in the survey process.
Mm-hmm.
And so having them at the table was super important. I think, Alice, and I don't know the numbers, but we had a very large percent. You can go to the link is in our in the chat about our site, but we had a large number of young people, like a lot of young people completed the survey, and we thought that was super important. So you can move to the next slide, Alice. And so, we got the survey and we got the data in, and we created this roadmap for moving forward. And really, we thought, and this is, the Office of Behavioral Health in Colorado has been very helpful in this. We are now partnering with our Healthy Transitions grant to kind of work on this strategy together. But the real story became, we wanted to use this data not as something that went on the shelf, but data that would really help tell stories that would really inspire ongoing work. And so what we did is we met with them. We've got a lot of investment now in our state in this youth-driven program improvement. And with that investment, what I would tell you is, we now are about to launch a 7-member Vista Corps. I'm going to let Zai talk about that. They are deployed around the state. Their role is to do a pre-post. Y-VAL is the pre-post in our communities. They will be involved in assisting local agencies that want to do this information in actually taking and getting that data in and creating their own CQI process. And in that, using the tool, so if you look at our website, is under each one, we have our statewide data now that looks at areas of strength and areas of growth, is to continue that conversation over and over again. And so now, and we're in this really exciting place, is that we will have young people who will actually be our surveyors. They will be the young people that will also be facilitating agencies who want to join us in this YVAL journey, facilitating local agencies. So they are now our TA consultants that will be providing support to local community agencies, following up on the CQI process. The other thing that they're doing on a back end, which I say, you know, the YVAL is great for data, is we'll be developing youth move chapters. Each of them will be developing youth move chapters. And those young people are getting trained by our history museum. So History Colorado is training them in how to curate stories and how to understand data. And this is, I saw somebody in a question about stigma, right? As one of the things we know is that it's really hard sometimes for young people to talk about a situation that's so personal, and also that they're still in the midst of. And so we're using this model with our vistas and these young people to help tell ongoing stories, which I call, what's the story under the data? But really, when you look at this information, what is it that's important for us to know? And what and how can we help those that we're partnering with to better understand that? And so that really is kind of where we are as a state. The other part I will tell you is any agency can do this. So, you know, one of our partner sites in La Plata, so that's Durango, it's actually being run and they're doing it through their LGBT community center. We have homeless shelters, youth homeless shelters that are joining and are part of this conversation. We have juvenile justice facilities that are stepping in. And what I think is important to understand is sometimes there's this worry that the YVAL is a test. And when we get the data back, we're being measured on how good are we doing, and are we a good county. And I know that when we were doing this, there was this behind the scenes conversation about a little peer pressure might be good. And we really put this in, a little peer learning might be good. And so we're also partnering with those adult partners who are in it to be teams with our vistas to come up with their CQIS process, their CQI process. And then in that, there's some peer learning that will be really specific across with our leaders in agencies at multiple levels, so they can problem solve. So what does this mean from a board perspective? We put young people on boards, but you know, is that really a meaningful role? And what does that look like? So people who have that similar role can talk. What does it mean when we talk about bringing on youth peer specialists? What does it mean when we talk about partners that maybe don't serve directly? And you know, that in Colorado, I saw Shy on here, you know, we have partners for children's mental health. That's Colorado's Center of Excellence for Mental Health. And, you know, we've been having those conversations because it's the leaders, and often the leaders on that advisory board are not those who have direct contact with young adults, but this data is available for them to be thinking about thoughtfully as they're developing policies. So I'm going to flip to the next slide and really invite you, Zai, to talk a little bit more about what's happening and kind of what you're doing now.
Yeah, absolutely. And just like Kippy has said, really, we're wanting youth with lived experience, because a lot of the times when I'm talking to youth in my community and I'm trying to get their voice, their experience, they're like, oh no, like nobody wants to hear about that. But no, that's exactly what we want to hear. We want to hear not only what you've been through, but how we can empower you to help other youth in our community. So just like Kippy said, we're developing our own local youth move chapters, and I'm in the works for Youth Move Colorado Springs, outside of Youth Move Colorado. But really what we're going to do with those is those are going to be, just like Kippy has said, those are going to be hubs for youth to be a part of, for us to get this data, for us to really highlight their voice in different systems and be like, hey, this is your place, this is your home, and how we can, in other organizations, really highlight their voice in better ways. Yeah, Kippy, so do you want to jump into really more about what the other vistas are doing and how we're going to be working together?
Yeah, and so the statewide vistas, so we'll have 7 of them. We have 2 of them who are in what we call urban communities. We have 2 that will be in what we call suburban, and the rest will all be in rural or frontier. Then we have 1 Vista who will be linked to COAC's soon developed, we're working on it, we've been working on it for years, the Colorado Youth Hub. And so one of the things that they'll be doing is what we call youth-driven program improvement. So each of the Vistas using their data kind of get we call it a passion project, but really it's what are they learning with the data, and where should they think about doing this work? And, you know, Zai, I know I'll let you jump in about your racial equity work you're starting to do. We have 1 Vista that's going to be looking at homeless young adults. Like I said, we have 1 Vista or 1 young person who is focusing on LGBT in one of our very small rural communities. Up in another small rural community, this Vista is going to be using their data to look at CHAFE services for our state and the partnership with mental health programs, because we know there's such a gap in easy access, or how to young people in foster care who have high rates of mental health, how can they get equitable or appropriate services. So one of our Vistas is focusing in on that. We have another Vista who is going to be really focusing on some really interesting work around youth transitioning. So how do young people move from the children's system into the adult system? And we haven't done this yet because we don't know if it's appropriate, but you know, one of the things is that there's this talk about with those systems and we will be getting our first round of data, so it'll be interesting to do this, is we're actually going to begin surveying in one of our mental health systems. They want to look at how are their adult services that the young adults leaving the children's system, you know, are they really, are they set up to have youth voice at the table to improve those transition age youth services? And that's a great partnership we're doing with our Healthy Transitions grant. And I think that that's, you know, those are kind of a way that we're looking at it. And what I would encourage people to do as they look at this is to say, you know, what are those intersections where our young people are? And even in our own agencies, you know, we have these great divisions, but there might be one division that is really doing this amazing youth voice. It's where your youth peer specialists sit. It might be where you have a youth advisory board, but then young people are going to a clinical setting, and those are the ones that are working directly with your youth. And sometimes we don't understand, you know, in detail, what does it mean to really have youth-driven program improvement. So as this sits up, our Vistas will be providing training and working on the process. So that's one role. And then the last thing that we're really doing is, you know, Colorado is, I like to think that we're at this cutting edge, but we're also at this really interesting cutting edge of work of understanding what does it mean to have equitable services in places where there is not access? And people know us as the great ski resort, and people know us as, you know, I used to be called a sprout head, you know, so I got my advanced degree in Boulder at Naropa, so it's a Buddhist contemplative university. But what's important is there's things you know about us, but there's things you don't know about us. There's times where there's enough snow that if you are a young person living in one community, to get to that next service, you can't get through the road because it's closed. We also know that we have military bases, we have tribes, and not all those voices are there. And so when we started to think about youth peer support, we think the Y-VAL will be really kind of what we call this readiness tool, is don't start youth peer support until you have enough capacity to have buy-in at your organization, to be able to have young people driving that. Because in Zai, maybe I'll call on you to share a little bit about this, is oftentimes we bring young people to the table and there's no clarity about their role. And so I'm going to pause there. I'll let you talk about clarity of the role and how over the last 2.5 years it's changed for you. And then also I'll let you share a little bit about what you think your Vista Passion Project's going to be.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the clarity on my role, when I was first starting out, there was little to none. I think, just like Kippy has said, we wanted to make sure that youth voice was highlighted. I have lived experience in systems, and I've turned around on the other side. So we kind of knew we wanted to run with that, but in what direction? In the beginning, it was like, I'm not too sure. But over the years, what we've built is, like I've spoke on before, is building that serious youth support in all of our systems. So like now, I have a great relationship with all of our school districts locally. I have a great relationship with like our IOG and things like that. I like all these different relationships with many community leaders, different organizations. And what I do with those is seriously highlight youth voice. So anything that I don't personally know, I go find a youth that does know it. Because, for example, youth homelessness. I've never been homeless, but I do know that youth go through that. So I'm like, okay, let me partner with organizations that deal with youth homelessness, deal with services around trying to support youth that are homeless. And then I bring them around the table. When I bring them around the table, either I support them to that level of like, hey, present to this committee, or they'll give me all their information that they want me to know, and then I present it to our committee so that we can get some traction around, hey, this is a problem in our community, this is how we need to move forward. And really, we just start diving in from there. So I'm huge on youth voice in all aspects. If I don't know the answer, I know a couple of different youth that do know that answer. So I'm constantly building different panels of youth just to get to the like, hey, I'm not sure what this is about, so how can we know more about it? And as far as my own personal project, Kippy and I spoke about it before. I'm jumping into racial equity in our community. So what I've been doing is partnering with 4 or 5 school districts now, and I've been meeting with a panel of teachers and students and then some staff members. And what we've been doing is seriously like finding those inequities in our community and highlighting those, like, hey, what do you think our transition should be? What do you think our plan should be? And it's been very open as far as like youth being empowered to really lead these meetings. And I tell them no one is above the other person, not even myself or any of the staff members or the teachers included, really highlighting that youth voice and letting them know you're important. And we want to know, like, how do you feel in your community? How do you feel like racial equity is being talked about? Do you feel like this, and that? And so it's already been interesting in even starting that process.
Thanks, Sai. And as Alice, gets ready to transition to the next slide, I will tell you the one thing that Colorado is super excited to be a part of is, Youth Move has the Center for Peer Support and Peer Voice. And so we're one of the East, and Zai's nodding, is we have members of Office of Behavioral Health, so our state agency, who took the Y-VAL, and we have a small but mighty team that have been going to those meetings. And the office has dedicated some time now because they saw the data in the community. And now we're actually having that process happen in the Office of Behavioral Health. We have some work plans in place. There's things that we're looking at using each of those themes. So this gets back to, you can use it at any level, but what can a state agency do? And one of the things they're looking at is, how do we make sure this quality of youth voice is in our contracting, all our contracts. Another thing we're working on is, how can young people be actually involved in the reviewing of our grants that come in to approve the contracts that go out when the office gets the big grants, and how can those young adults also be on the interviewing committee? So I would say is, from little agencies to big agencies, it's possible to use this data to really improve what you're doing and to really inspire young people to step up. And our last Youth Move Colorado chapter chat had 45 young adults on it. And I have to say that this was 2 years ago we started our chapter, maybe not even 2 years ago. And we now have 45 young people who are at the table because the data gives them ability and language to be able to put things in words and be able to kind of share their point. And it puts them on a living level playing field with a lot of these adult meetings, I call, that we invite our young people to go to, but it allows them to really understand the story and know what their role is at those meetings. So Alice.
Okay, so now we've come to our third and final poll. This is an interesting question, right? So what we're asking you is, if you were to implement the Y-VAL at your agency, how do you think it would be the most useful? And here in the answers, we've highlighted 4 of the main ways that we've seen agencies implement the Y-VAL. So you could either, option 1, use the Y-VAL as a list of best practices as your agency starts thinking about developing new youth programs or revamping youth programs. The second option is, you could use the Y-VAL as a baseline assessment to have a clear picture of where your agency is at regarding youth engagement. The third option is you could use the YVAL to build a strategic plan and assess short, medium, and long-term goals. Or option four, you could use the YVAL as a pre and post intervention to measure the impact of a specific intervention. We'll launch the poll, and this is going to be one of those where you can select multiple options. And like Kippy said, I think it's important to note that there's no agency too big or too small to take the YVAL. There's no specific field that your agency should be in, as long as your agency wants to do youth engagement. I think this tool is very, can serve its purpose. What I really want to see is people answering everything, but I'm hoping I don't bias people's answers. And while we're waiting for the poll to wrap up, I will mention that the second option here, to use the YVAL as a baseline assessment, has been one of the main ways we've seen agencies use it. And then they use the results either to go to that next step and start facilitating a strategic planning process, or they would even use it to apply for funding and tell their funders, hey, this is where we know we're very strong and this is where we know we need to grow. We have this baseline assessment and we need additional funding to support our growth in these fields. We know what needs to happen and we just need the resources and tools to do so. And that's been a really interesting way to see the YVAL being used. I think we can close the poll. Great. Great. Well, it looks like it's pretty evenly split across all four options. I see that there's almost half of the people who would use it as a baseline assessment or to build a strategic plan, which is kind of what we see on the ground at Youth Move. Awesome. Thank you so much for participating in the polls. And I think we're going to start opening it up for Q&A.
Fantastic. Thanks to all of you. The information you provided was great. Before we start the Q&A, I have to say that I'm a big fan of the YVAL because I think it helps move theory to reality, breaking down that core value of youth-driven into specific indicators. So you know what you're looking for and you can assess your progress. We did this for the system of care concept and approach in a rating tool for implementation of the system of care approach. And this takes that one core value and breaks that down in the same way, giving you some specific indicators. And there's also, I should mention, a briefer instrument that measures the family-driven core value called the FAM-VOC, Family Voice. That was developed by Fredla and is also, I think, available and a good tool to look into both family-driven and youth-driven in the same way by measuring specific aspects and indicators. So you know you know what you're going to see if you're getting there. And we have a lot of questions. A couple of them are on the mechanics. Allison wanted to know if there is a required certification or credentials needed to use the YVAL.
No, like Kippy mentioned, it's really open to any agency. I will mention that because this is a validated tool, sometimes agencies use it for a specific purpose because they are looking for that validation, that validated tool to do whatever they need to do next, whether that's applying for a grant or as part of a grant requirement, they need to be using a validated tool. So no credentials needed, but if you as an agency need a tool that's validated, this is a really good option.
Okay, great. And is there a cost to using it?
Great question too. So this tool was developed using public dollars. So the tool itself is publicly available. You can go to our website that I think was linked previously, or contact info@youthmovenational.org to access a PDF of the tool. However, at Youth Move National, we provide the additional service of implementing the survey at your agency from A to Z. That means creating the online link, supporting your agency in finding respondents and sending reminders, etc. And more importantly, we provide the final report and some conversation after the report is issued with agency leadership and your youth program staff to break down the results and discuss some of the results together, and together find some achievable and meaningful short, medium, and long-term goals. So that's the full YVAL package, and that is available at an additional cost. And depending on the scope of that additional support, the cost varies. So I really encourage you to contact Youth Move National to find out more about what would best meet your agency's needs.
Okay, great. It's nice to know that there's some consultation that people could take advantage of if they need some support in doing this. There are a number of questions around involving youth. One from Carl was, can you comment on any conflicts that you might see between giving youth voice and then exposing them to stigma? For example, if youth are getting services in a mental health agency, is it okay to encourage them to be part of speaking up in communities, and then that may create some stigma for them or some, issues for them in terms of their own service delivery?
Zai, do you mind answering a little bit about your experience of bringing young people who are getting services through joint initiatives and bringing them to the table? What has that been like?
Yeah, so really what it's been like is it kind of initially does put the youth in that awkward position where they're not really wanting to represent themselves or like what's wrong with whatever system that they're in. So say that they're in some sort of therapy system, and then we go and ask them or give them a survey about the therapy system. They don't necessarily want to say anything negative because they're still actively working with them. They're still actively like engaging with them, still like, hey, like still being a part of that system. But what we do is we kind of figure it the way of like, hey, it's not going to hurt anyone's feelings. We just want the best service, the best that we can be for ourselves. And what we do is we're just telling them we're using it for improvement. So I think telling youth that engagement, that we're wanting to improve systems and not just use what they're saying is like, oh, you're being extremely negative, you don't know what you're talking about. No, we empower them and we tell them, hey, everything you're telling us, we're going to use it to improve for the next family, for the next one, and to even improve for you, since we're working with you directly. Did that answer it, Kippy?
Yeah, and by their responses are confidential, right?
Yes.
Not
yes.
like to be identified, so there wouldn't be, you can assure young people if they participate, it won't have any implications for their service delivery. Information is not going to go back to their providers or even to the agency if they have negative, any negative feedback.
Absolutely, it's definitely confidential. Like we don't provide their names, we don't provide how they feel, anything like that, because and that also brings value. I mean, sometimes they'd like to be in front and they can provide their information, but most of the time it's completely anonymous to keep them comfortable and keep them moving forward.
And related to that is, how do you identify young people and encourage them to take the survey and get involved in the data and analysis and such? How do you do that?
So I'll start from what we did in Colorado, and then Alice, maybe you can add some. What we did in Colorado with our sites is we encouraged them to look at across the continuum of youth engagement. If you had a youth advisory board, a lot of people said, well, we'll go to our youth advisory board and we'll ask them to fill it out. And what we said is, look at it as this way. Look at it, young people who are very involved and they're part of your youth voice, but who are the young people that might be getting services and wondering, does their voice matter? And then we also, for many of them, what was really interesting is we encouraged them to reach out, and a couple of our sites actually invited siblings of those that were service recipients, mostly because that gets to what Zai was talking about too, is we find some of our best youth voice comes from family members. And we talk about parents, the family, the parent having a voice, but we forget that siblings need to be at the table. And so they worked and they kind of came up with their list. I then did some work in some of the communities. I went down and in Pueblo, we just actually had, I call them Javas and juices. And so we had coffee or juice, and we sat around and we talked about what this survey was about and asked them to help us identify who else to survey. And so that's how we started to identify our young people to participate.
Great. And so there's a number of questions also around community involvement and participation, not just young people. So how do you get communities interested in doing the YVAL? And what do you need to get them started?
Do you want to start, Alice, and then I can add what we did in Colorado?
Sure. So I will say, I think what Kippy said about discussing the tool prior to having people take it is really important. I think people are always skeptical, like Zai also mentioned, about being assessed and evaluated and whether they're doing a good job. But sending people the tool on paper before getting their commitment to participate in the evaluation, in the assessment, has been very helpful. When people see on paper what this evaluation tool, this assessment tool is about, I think they get a better understanding and they see what they're working towards themselves. And like Kippy and Zai both mentioned, it also gives a lot of language and some practical tools around what true youth engagement strategies might look like. So I will say that's one of the I think the most effective ways that people have had communities engaged on the tool. I will also mention that it's really hard to implement the YVAL if there is no community buy-in. If the agency that is taking the YVAL doesn't authentically believe in youth engagement or thinks that this tool is too burdensome or not relevant, that also means a lot about where they're at in their level of youth engagement. And that's also something that we can work with, right? But implementing the YVAL tool with an agency or a community that's not ready for it is a discussion point in and of itself and something that we can work on.
Right. And I'm wondering if some communities or individuals within communities might see it as being judged as an organization, might be concerned about that. Maybe they're not as receptive to the data because of those kinds of concerns. Have you encountered that?
Yes, for sure. And I think that's something that we're also very careful of up front. For example, when we have a cohort, like Kippy's example is very nice in Colorado, where there were multiple sites taking the tool at the same time. We had a very long discussion before the results were out about whether we were going to share each agency's results with each other, or if each agency was going to have their own scores and not compare themselves to others. There's some benefit in both, right? If there's a lot of trust between the communities that take the YVAL, I think a lot of the steps can be built from that collaboration. Let's say agency A scored very low in theme 3, but very high in theme 5, and vice versa for agency B. Then they might be able to collaborate and talk about strategies that work for their agency for theme 3 and for agency B for theme 5, and be able to, again, collaborate and work together towards a solution. And we found a lot of benefit in that way.
Great. Thank you. A couple more questions on mechanics. How long does it take to take the YVAL?
So the YVAL tool itself, we say, we ask people to leave 30 minutes to take to really think deeply about the questions. I think in reality, it takes on average 21.2 minutes for people to take, but we really like people to take their time and think about their answers. And then bigger picture, how long does it take to implement the tool at your agency? If we're trying to time box it really quickly between point A, where the agency expresses interest and already has a list of people in mind that they want to have take the survey, and the reporting and some follow-up discussions, we like to say at least 6 weeks between that initial point and the final point.
Okay, and if you don't have 15 people in your organization that can take the YVAL, or there isn't really a youth program yet, or the agency is really small, what do you do in situations like that?
So I'll mention the theory and then I'll hand it off to Kippy, because that was the case in Colorado for a few. But we have several options. One is if you work with Youth Move National, we can help facilitate a conversation around the YVAL with the few staff that you have at your agency and help kind of verbally discuss the items and talk about where you think the pain points are, where some points of growth might be, and where your strengths are. So really using the tool as a facilitation guide. Another option is to work with agencies that you might collaborate with very closely. So let's say your agency itself only has 7 staff people, but you collaborate or outsource some of your youth program or youth consultants with an agency that's hosting some AmeriCorps Vista or a youth-run organization, and they might be a good person to be taking the YVAL with because they have that youth programming and youth service delivery perspective. Kibby, do you want to add anything about how we can take the YVAL if we're a small agency?
You know, what we found with some of our smallest communities and small agencies, what was interesting is they were really umbrellaed or partnered, exactly like what Alice said, with other agencies. And so putting them together really was useful. We also had a lot of conversations about that it's beyond program staff. And it was really interesting, you know, when I asked them, I said, well, who helps you with your organization? You know, we had one organization that had their entire board take the YVAL. And then they had a foundation who funds them take the YVAL of their perception of what they thought. They were part of it. And then we actually, some of them asked a couple parents. And so they were able, with both the number of young adults, their board, some family members, and kind of those external folks to actually get a nice survey point about it. The other thing that we did, which I think is an interesting thing, which Alice said, is we encouraged them, even if they didn't have the list of number of people, to take the survey themselves. We found a lot of value in them doing it and reflecting. I knew what some of the smaller data is, like I kind of knew who had the smaller data, and I'm able to have conversations. But what was great is by them taking the survey anyways, and then looking at the national averages, and in our state now we have state averages, they were able to kind of get their story under what they believed their data was. And we found that even just having that survey and talking about the questions, they were okay sharing and problem solving around it. So I do think there's ways to do it in more of a facilitated process.
Okay, thank you. There's one other issue that was raised. I think this will be our final question. That is about state or local legislative policy and budget reforms on that support youth and young adult voice, and whether we're aware of any of those. But also, I'm adding to this question myself, is whether results of something like the YVAL might contribute to being able to implement some agency or policy or budget reforms that support a stronger youth and young adult voice.
I'm smiling because this is all Kippy.
Yeah, so I'll say yes and yes. So interestingly, in Colorado last year, we had a behavioral health task force, and they surveyed some young people and got some data in. And actually, I was just approached by the person who's now doing the aftermath of that and doing some of the facilitation, and they're actually interested in our data, and they want to use this to really inform how to move things forward. What I will tell you is now we have our data, YVAL is like a fire out here. People want to know what we're doing. But what has been really important is a couple of the themes are really powerful around it. And so the one about, you know, are young people paid for their work, like the workforce development strategy, it's really interesting is that I would say that that one has become pretty high in our work, and it is driving some policy discussions. You know, we do have a statewide youth development plan. We do have youth consultants. Office of Behavioral Health has hired a youth consultant. We have our 7 vistas coming on. And so what's interesting is the data is being used and is being thought about as a concept of talking about what do we need to do to improve things, and then also what do we need to do to really kind of create that vision. We have a youth advisory board that advises our state legislature, but we're working with them right now to make sure that lived experience youth have access. So I would say any data is really good. The other thing I always talk about is no data, no dollars. And so from a no data, no dollars perspective is a lot of grants I see now ask this very important question of, you know, how do you involve consumers in your work? You can say, well, we have a youth advisory board. You can say we have this, but you could go in and say, you know, we looked at this and what we understand is this is where we're at and this is where we want to get to. And I think from a foundation perspective, and what I found with philanthropists as they hear about this opportunity, they're really starting to understand is that there is a mechanism for them to gauge, but more importantly, a mechanism for them to include or increase consumer voice in all of the work that they're doing. And so I would say is that the more you use this, I think it informs those systems about how they can use data beyond just saying, yeah, we do that, to actually say, we know we do it and we'll explain how, and we also know these are areas we can grow. So I don't know if I answered it, but that was kind of how we see it.
Yes, very helpful, Kippy. I'm going to ask each of you if you have a final thought or comment that you'd like to share, something that maybe you left out. It's up to you. Kippy?
I see Zai go off. I'll let you start, Zai.
Zai, there you go.
Yeah, no, I think I added everything. No, I'm fine for last points. Thank
Great.
you.
All right.
Yeah, I'll share from my perspective. I think we're doing better work in Colorado because of this. I look at the growth of Zai in the last 2.5 years. His being able to be part of this process and learn and now know how to really explain this in such a well way. I think the whole process of going through this and the training has actually upped the game for our young adults who are showing up and doing the important work for our system of care.
Great. Alice?
I always feel like final words have to be incredibly intelligent and articulate, but I will just add again that I think the YVAL tool is made for every single agency, regardless of the size and where you're at on youth engagement. There's always something you can learn from the tool. And I strongly encourage you to reach out to Youth Move or contact Kippy or Zai and talk directly to them about their experience using the YVAL and pros and cons and where they're at now.
Great. I'd like to thank to our outstanding presenters, Alice, Kippy, Zaishan, great job. Thank you for sharing your expertise and some very concrete strategies with us. And thank you to our interpreters, Kelly and Noel. And thanks to all of you for joining this segment of Training Institutes Live. Reminder to register for future workshops. The next ones are on April 1st. The link is posted in the chat. And we'd also very much appreciate your taking just a couple of minutes to complete the evaluation for this workshop that is also posted in the chat. We do take your feedback very seriously, and it'll help us to shape the upcoming workshops in this series. So again, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you on the first Thursday of every month for Training Institutes Live.